today I welcome you all to the 12th episode of Sunday Samvad. So Sunday Samvad as a vertical of MyTISS is a kind of an alumni connect platform where we welcome TISS alumni from diverse work areas so that they can share their professional journey and guide students to channelize their career aspirations in various fields. Today I am very honored and glad to welcome Ms Antara Mukherjee for the 12th episode, which is on a program designing, implementation and negotiating value systems. And this topic is kind of an esoteric topic that ma'am and I discussed, and she was so excited to talk about the planning and implementation of projects. And I like to introduce Ms. Antara before going into the details of the topic. Ms. Antara is a kind of trained social worker who graduated from TISS Mumbai's School of Social Work in 2017. And since then, she has engaged with various social issues at with multi-dimensional levels, from the grassroots to policy planning and analysis, to fact-finding teams, and to being an organizing member in various even public tribunals, Jan Morchas and national level unions. Through their works as she worked as a program associated with Delhi Forum, and there she engaged with NGOs across India and those who are working in the field of social movements. After that, she joined Deepalia, a children's organization that works on education as a tool for social development as well as women's empowerment. In that work profile, she designed various workshops, multiple awareness workshops, analyzed projects for improvements, and worked closely with children in schools across Delhi, NCR, and Greater Noida to develop social engagement programs. Currently, she's working she's working on various independent projects and even aspiring to pursue further education. And I'm again very much glad to welcome Ms. Antara on this platform. And talking about the topic, that is or the episode 12 of Sunday Samvad, it is program designing, implementation and negotiating value systems. There are various important and interesting aspects that Ms. Antara would be talking upon, but starting with her role in and functions and the workshops projects that she has undertaken in her professional journey since last more than 3 years. Then she would be moving on to the challenges and limitations that she faced in her professional journey. At the same time, she would be then moving on to a very interesting topic of political aspects of working as a social worker with organizations in the developmental sector. Then connecting the personal and the professional self. She will be talking about another aspect of emotional intelligence, which I think is the need of the hour, even more so in the challenging times of the pandemic, where we as development practitioners are at the forefronts, and Ms. Antara has been working since then also. And then she will be moving on to the various motivating factors that can serve as the reason and purpose to get into this field of development or get into the field of a professional social worker. Lastly, I again welcome Ms. Antara on this platform, and her approaching her has been a pleasure to me. And since our interaction also, I have personally learned many things. So I expect that participants also can reflect and learn various things from Ms. Antara. And as she says, we can start in solidarity. And with your permission, ma'am, we can begin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Um, I think the title of this session, this episode, is something which is um, it's something that I've kind of spoken about for a long time. I've always kind of thought about my work specifically like this. I've had the opportunity to reflect on what my work does and what my work does for me and how I do my work. So I'm hoping that I can talk about certain important things that maybe will translate to how you hope to work in the future or you're currently working, and I hope that I'm able to address the side of social work that gets more talked about in the branches that work exclusively with mental health, or all of these associated acts. So I hope that I'm able to answer those queries if you have. So I think I passed out of TISS in 2017, and the first ever professional placement I had was in Delhi Forum, and it's an NGO that is that has an FCRA. It has an FCRA this thing, and it's based in Delhi, and I went straight from doing finishing my masters to an organization that was an extremely live and kicking organization. And when I say live and kicking, that's because this organization works purely in tandem with social movements that are going across the country. So in DF, my role was that of a program associate, and there was not a lot of people in that office anyway. It was an office run between 4 people. So I was the only person with my job title in that situation. So I went into that kind of scenario quite unprepared. But so the things that I did for Delhi while I was in Delhi Forum is that I worked on a lot of advocacy campaigns. I worked on a lot of, I did a lot of logistical work. I was part of conceptualizing events which were both in terms of social movements, but also in terms of holding massive public gatherings in Delhi. I was also part of the planning and writing of memorandums. So we worked with a lot of diverse social movements. So we worked with fishermen and coastal rights. I also worked with, I had the privilege of working with, had the honor of working with with Narmada Bachao Andolan for whatever work they had in Delhi. So we were like a administrative and secretarial head of these social movements. And so I was involved with doing the press for my organization for these organizations. I was also part of organizing, there were, the Kisan Long March that happened both in Bombay and Delhi. I was part of the organizing team in Delhi, along with as part of All India Kisan Sabha support group. So I had a lot of exposure to these kind of social events and social movements, and this kind of work. So it involved a lot of editorial work, a lot of practically being in touch with the community, being able to have conversations and translate that to documents that you can send to government offices, to MPs, meeting MPs. So that was basically what I did at Delhi Forum for about 2 years. Then moving on from there, I switched to Dipalia, which was a completely different environment because it was an organization for children. And Dipalia, unlike Delhi Forum, which is run for social movements, Dipalia uh, has a more formal structure. It works with both. It works in tandem with CSR projects, but also individual donors, and works with a lot of projects, ongoing projects across the country, specifically in the northern parts. So in Dipalia, I was the assistant program manager, looking into monitoring and evaluation specifically. And again, my kind of work involved advocacy, planning and strategy, editing reports. I created a lot of workshops and was also kind of part of. I was one of the people who was creating the workshop manual for the organization. I also did a lot of projects with affiliated institutions. I was involved with evaluating students' performances and seeing how students score vis-a-vis the kind of teaching methods that Dipalia used, because Dipalia has its own schools and learning centers as well. And specifically, I took up a lot of different projects, one of which was Project Umang, which happened after the horrendous North Delhi riots. So we were involved in providing immediate care to children in relief camps, specifically in Mustafabad. So, designing a camp that involved activities that would would be both therapeutic as well as educational for children. And I was part of Project Study, where I designed a workshop for menstrual hygiene and awareness. And we catered to about 2,000 students in a span of 4 months. So I was both the facilitator as well as I wrote the workshops. And so these were basically the kind of things I was involved in. And before I go any further, I also would like to apologize about one thing. I have 2 dogs, so if at any point in this entire thing, if you hear a lot of barking, I'm really sorry. Please be patient with me. My dogs have a lot of opinions. So I'll just, I hope they don't decide to speak now. So moving forward, so like I said, like both of these places gave me such a wide range of things to address, such a wide range of work, because going from a place which was highly political, fast-paced, we would work through the nights to create an event the next morning. There would be no timetable as such. You moved as and when the community moved, and that was our work. And then coming into Depalia, which is a lot more structured, has a more I would say, it's very systematic. The work is very systematic. It is very disconnected to the way, like the way my earlier organization was in terms of politics. So it's very much an organization for children. And so I think between my experiences of working in these two organizations that are at like ends of two extremes, I ended up learning a lot of things, both as part of my skills, but also as what it takes to be able to work in diverse organizations and to be able to do justice to yourself. So one of the subtitles that we kind of worked up was about the challenges and the limitations of writing programs, and how you implement those programs, how you design these programs. And like I said, I was essentially always a part of the I was always part of the core group which would write these concept notes that would then build up to maybe fact-finding reports, or would build up to, say, public tribunals, or would go into the into the dockets that we would give to, say, MPs and all of these things. Then then kind of having to tone down that language, that kind of, and to tone down that kind of way of work, so that it is more suitable to an NGO that works with children. So you have to really go back to the basics when you start working with children. Also, I will try to speak in Hindi beach mein, but my Hindi is very bad. So I hope there is nobody here who's not able to understand. I'm really sorry, but I'll try and go back and forth in English and Hindi. So when I think about challenges of designing and implementation, one of the first things that comes to my mind is the fact that, there are, the way I see it, there are two situations. And these two, there could be other categories as well, but these are the two that I think are more effective in working. So one is a post-donation situation, and one is a pre-donation situation. Now, considering that I haven't really worked in a government organization, a lot of the work depends on the money you get, which is both from people, from projects, from CSR projects, could be individual donors, could be through fundraising, right? So when you have a pre-donation situation, right? So as a person who was involved in writing programs, I would have to attend those meetings, or I would have to read the clients or the donors, like a mammoth list of what all they want to be done. Whether or not the money fits the budget or it's excessive, they would always have an expectation that these are the things that need to be done. So in a post-donation situation, usually, you already get the money and you are told to use it, as per your needs and requirements, design a project and send it over after the money has already been given. So in these two situations, as somebody who writes a program, it's very crucial to understand the difference between what a client expects if they are waiting to give you the money until you bring up something concrete, versus a client that trusts your intuitions and gives you the money and says, okay, go ahead and design a program and send it to us. So they don't really get involved with, they don't really put themselves as, obstacles in the way we visualize how to use the money. So in a post-donation situation, obviously, we have a lot more control. As a person who was writing programs, I had a lot more creative freedom to write and design these projects. Whereas in a pre-donation situation, you have less control. You are more trying to fulfill a client's or donor's idea of what they want to do for the organization, not specifically the community. So again, in both these situations, either you're thinking about the donor and their and satisfying their needs, or you're thinking about the community and how this money can work for them. So depending on the donor, one of the biggest challenges is, I think, language. um, चाहे आप प्रोग्राम हिंदी में लिखें या अंग्रेजी में लिखें, there is one very specific problem, which is that single piece of paper alone can determine whether your organization will get money or not get money. So in my previous organization, it was always a post-donation situation. So we had ultimately all the control. Whereas in this situation, in Dipalia, for example, because it has a lot of CSR-funded projects, that single piece of paper can determine whether you get the money or you don't get the money. So one of the first challenges is always the language that you use to write a program or an implementation, a program structure. One of the things that I specifically was not very good at was when I was studying social work, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the technical parts of writing a program. So when I was still learning on the job, but one of the things that I learned was that, when you're working in an organization that works with social issues that may be slightly less severe than others, clients and donors expect you to satisfy their idea or their vision of what a project should be. So language was the first challenge. How do you write something to convince a donor to give you that money, especially in a pre-donation situation? So that involved, for example, it involved a movie. It involved you to try and design programs and use a language that is there on paper and can, okay, I in fact, before going into that, I'd like to say that one of the things that we must remember is that when you're writing or designing a program, how you write it on paper doesn't necessarily have to be how you implement it in the field. And that is one thing that allows you to then fiddle around with your program implementation and your structure a little bit, because ultimately it's the community that matters. The money is important. So to do justice to a client, of course, your language has to be right. You have to tick off all the things they've asked you to do. But at the same time, how do you leave loopholes and leeways for you to do things other than that, or in addition to that, or in spite of that, in the field once you implement the program, and be accountable to the donor as well. So I'll give you an example later on from my personal experiences in these organizations. So again, another thing is that, it is important to remember that implementation is vastly different. So I think that, up and coming social workers, one thing that you should be comfortable with the fact is that your program, the way you write a program, is something that is completely up to you. The only expectation any donor or any client, in my experience, has is how you use the budget. What's on the left side of the column, which is all text, doesn't become as important as the money factor. So you do have a lot of control in how you design it. The only challenge is that if there are things that you want to include in it and the donor may not be comfortable, then you have to find a way to put it into the text so that it's there, but it's not obvious. And I had to do that when I was designing the menstrual awareness workshops, because I was working in schools in Greater Noida, in really isolated villages with really conservative, the ecosystem is very conservative. And I spoke to my supervisors and my colleagues, and I said that I don't want to say that only women menstruate. I want to say that all bodies with the female reproductive organs will menstruate. That is along the line. So basically, I wanted to introduce the idea that we are not just going for a man and man or woman kind of a bifurcation. So a lot of my colleagues said maybe that will not go down well, considering you're going to Greater Noida, you're going to a certain kind of school, and also the fact that maybe the donor who's donating the money does not want to be, he or she does not want you to talk about something which is not normal, something that they don't want to talk about. They don't want to address the idea that other bodies also menstruate. So I kind of when I was designing the program, I did not mention that in my text. When I was writing the program about how I want to do it, even in the workshop, I was very careful about what words I use, so that I did not create a hiccup right at the time of writing that workshop or the paper. So we should remember that despite all of these challenges and limitations, which are largely external, social workers have agencies. We should not limit our scope due to administrative rules or even client rules, because a meeting in a boardroom cannot determine how you implement a program for the community. So as social workers, you are not there as extension of the organization alone. You're also the extension of the community. So I think one thing that, social workers always find ourselves is in the middle ground. We are always in the middle because we have to negotiate with those who control that action and those who will be, who will go through the consequences of that action. So if required, if you cannot sometimes, so for example, in this case, I faced a lot of opposition about mentioning this in such a community. But I took my pilot session in a school and I introduced that idea to the girls, and I realized that they were very open to understanding. They were very curious. Okay, what do you mean by other bodies? So, as much as I could, understanding the fact that these are students of a certain class, of a certain standard, of a certain level, be it 6th standard to 9th standard or 11th standard. So I had to kind of, make changes in the way I talked about it, but I definitely did talk about it. So I made sure that I did it anyway. So there are times when you might have to go a little rogue, but that is also because ultimately you have a bigger picture of change, and that may not be something that somebody else sees, but as social workers, it is up to us to do that work. So I think ultimately the concept has to be that you are looking at community over everything. So that is the framework that I at least use. Then coming to, I'll come back to the limitations part at the end again. Coming to the political aspects of designing and implementation. Now, this is something which is extremely essential, considering that, social workers that are being produced currently in the past 5 to 10 years have seen a lot of changes in society, in governance, in legislation, in how development models are taking place across different states across India. So we've been exposed to a lot of different ideas. So there is this understanding, despite that, across the world, that social workers are supposed to be the foot soldiers of whosoever employs them, specifically in terms of government agencies. I've never had the opportunity to work in an organization that is aided by the government or owned by the government, but I've realized that social workers are, everybody assumes that we are apolitical, that, our work is people's work. There is nothing, and when I say political, I am not referring to a political ideology or a political party or anything like that. Just the fact that social workers have political opinions. And going from that, social workers are expected to be political and are apolitical, and I don't agree with that. I definitely do not agree with that. I think that, political frameworks are essential to how you work on the field. You need to have a set of political values, principles, ethics, a framework within which you envision how community and society should be. If you do not have that yet, that means you will have to read some more, um, you know, try and find more networks where you can talk about these issues, try and look at different organizations and the work they do. You will always find them talking about one or two people who they take interest. I mean, a lot of government agencies, a lot of organizations that work at the grassroots always quote Gandhi's idea of social work or Gandhi's idea of community. And so, you have to really look into that and have that framework for yourself, because once you have that framework, everything else will fall into place. You are not an open, there's no, I mean, on one hand, yes, you should learn on the go, but it should also be that you have your own framework within which you mold other things into. And I think if you don't have that, it might translate into, not being able to say, uh, function as well as you would want to, considering that organizations expect you to have a voice. Now, whether that voice is more submissive towards the administration, which I realize you have to do in a lot of cases, I had to do it, or it is more in tandem with the community. So politics already exists at the field. So to say that as social workers we are apolitical, I think is highly it's a very contentious thing to say, because when you go to the community, there is politics already there. Politics exists at that grassroots level. So if you are not somebody who or if you're not allowed to through your organizational framework, to understand that politics, to be able to converse with that politics, to be able to work with that politics, because the community itself has an idea of liberation. They have an idea of self-actualization. There is politics to that. So as social workers, you really have to, even if you are somebody who's apolitical, or if you are somebody who doesn't have the same political ideas as the community, you have to have a political framework. You have to have certain fixed ideas. And when I say fixed, I mean it should be the basis of the work that you do. It can change, but there should be a base to how you look at social issues and how you look at solving those social issues. So for example, coming from the first organization, when I was in Delhi Forum, again, it was a very political space, and there was not just political frameworks, various political frameworks kind of communicating with each other, but it was also, there was political ideologies, there were political parties, the understanding was a lot more like I said, live and kicking. So you had to adapt really well. You had to go from speaking to people having a certain political ideology and then going to somebody else and being able to also converse with them. And they might actually belong to the same group, but they are subgroups. So it involves, you have to understand those nuances. You have to be able to understand those little things, little tweaks, little turns here and there. And essentially, if you can work with those, then your social work solutions, your social work interventions will be so holistic. They will be all rounded in the way you plan, in the way you see how you should intervene with social issues and interventions. So on a personal level, I think that I was, so going from the first office that I was working in to Dipalia, like I said, Dipalia is very apolitical in the way that it functions, in the sense that because it's a children's organization, the understanding is that there's not a lot of politics involved. Going from the previous organization to this organization, for me, that was a massive emotional block and a practical block to how I was working, because it was very hard for me to come down from the understanding that politics does drive the work that we do. Coming to an organization where, you know, there is not a lot of conversation about politics, or if there was, it wasn't always the one I wanted to be involved in, or, the understanding of how politics works in society was completely different of that of the organization and for me, and they had different reasons for that, and I had a different reason for that. So working in organizations that do not allow a space for you to express yourself and your ideas, like, right before this session started, I was talking to two of my colleagues here, and I spoke about the fact that a lot of organizations will not allow the space for new age upcoming social workers to come in and intervene or change the way things are being done. बहुत सारी organizations हैं जो 30, 40, 50 साल से काम करती हैं, और उसमें बहुत ही senior colleagues हैं जो काम संभालते हैं. So in such a situation, as a 23-year-old or as a 24-year-old, you walk in there with your degree and your new age ideas and all your new opinions and all of that, and it can be disconcerting for both parties involved, both the social worker and the organizations. So a lot of organizations that do not allow the space for social workers to come in and express themselves, to say that no, maybe we should try it our way, maybe your way can now evolve into something more practical, something more effective, it is not really received well. And I think that is one of the reasons why in today's day and age, so many social workers do not feel like they get the job satisfaction from the organizations that work at, even though financially it may be, giving, your salaries might be good, but you still don't feel like you're able to do any work, or you're able to do justice to your ideas of social work or how you want to serve the community. So it is essential to, honestly, I would say stick to your guns. It is essential to stick to your guns, to have that framework in your head and have it so, just make it so solid that, you don't question yourself when you're out there. Social workers are also professionals. And one thing that we must remember is that with specifically students or TISS social workers who go into government agencies or go into CSR agencies, the government changes every 5 years. Social workers don't change along with that government. Social workers are there for 15, 20, 30, 40 years working in the field, and they see different governments every 5 years. That does not mean that our work has to constantly, our politics has to change along with that. Because essentially, your work with the community is longer, it's long term. So it is very essential that you know where you stand in terms of your political ideas, your limitations to work. For a lot of people, I know personally a few social workers who left their places of work because the projects that they were involved in didn't necessarily um, fit their ideas of the ethics of social work or the principles of social work, or was against their values. So I understand that that is also a reality, and that's why it is essential that whatever you do, you stick to your guns if the priority is community, if the priority is development of the community and society. And the only way you can stick to your guns is if you have a political framework, if you have something that nobody else can question or manipulate, and you will then have ideas, diverse ideas that are born with this idea, whatever this political framework is. It can be an ideology, it can be a sociological theory, it can be anything, just something that is you and that makes, for example, for me, social work was mostly about the feeling of unbelongingness. Like, this word for me is very essential to how I work. So, like, for example, like personally, like I would like to give this example, because I feel like a lot of us do have personal things that translate into larger behaviors that we have, which is, I'm an adopted child. And so when I was younger, I faced a lot of bullying. I mean, of course, in Delhi also, like in a public school in Delhi. But what it taught me was that, unbelongingness is a very true emotion that, a lot of us can carry all our lives, and specifically even within marginalized communities, that feeling of unbelongingness is there. So my political framework, my social work theory is always about how to reduce this unbelongingness. And that runs everything that I do. So like that, find something that works for you. Find a phrase, find anything. It can also be just a saying. It can be anything. What I mean to say is that you need to have something which drives all of your work. And it is essential that you find this. The sooner that you find it, it'll be easier for you to work in organizations and also be able to make the work for you. So I think, and also, like, I will go into the in the motivating factors. I like to talk more about this personal kind of association where people have a lot of conflicts with their own organizations. And so from here, the next thing that I thought I would talk about is, which even Radhich mentioned, was emotional intelligence, or in that sense, how to deal with social work emotionally. When I was in, some of my colleagues from TISS are here online, and I was discussing it with them, and I said that, when we were being taught social work, especially in the specifically social work theory classes, nobody ever, I don't remember any particular moment where we were told that, okay, as social workers, you also need to take care of yourself, or as social workers, you must be aware of how you are feeling, you must be aware of your emotions, about, go to therapy, maybe go to group therapy and talk to others, build a network. These are words that we didn't hear as social workers. At least I didn't hear. I could still be wrong, but I feel like that was not something that was mentioned to us. So, social workers are in many ways also counselors, because we do a lot of uncertified counseling. When you talk to a community, when you are sitting down with the family of a student and discussing their performance, or reasons at home why the student might not be performing that well, you are essentially doing that work anyway. So it is not a far-fetched idea to say that social workers also need social work. They also need access to therapy. They need access to spaces that allow them to express themselves. Now, for example, working in I'll give you an example later on. So working in organizations can be very demanding, especially if you come with an expectation that everything, every single idea, every single thought, every single radical, new, refreshing idea that you come in with will be received well. And it's that, I understand that, that rose-tinted glass, it comes with, the minute you pass out of masters in social work, you feel so alive with all this knowledge, and, you're like, okay, gotta go do this thing, this particular idea can change, it's innovation, it's creativity, it's a lot of it is emotional as well, specifically if you have found if you are somebody who's very empathetic. So those reasons can run very deep in your psyche as well. So it's kind, I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing to, you know, keep this expectation, because this is what drives your work. But it may not always be validated by the organizations or the people or the individuals that you choose to work with, and that can be very frustrating, that can be very upsetting, it can be very detrimental to your mental health as well. So for example, you know, for I mean, when I was working in Depalia, you know, one of the understandings, that I had was that you can talk about um, so when I was writing the program specifically, I remember discussing political sides. Like I was trying to justify why certain things, if they are added to this project, will be politically very, you know, like very consequential for the communities. And I was told that ये सब लिखने की जरूरत नहीं है, ये सब बोलने की जरूरत नहीं है, उनको क्या लेना देना, right? And for me, that sentence was essentially, and again, it is an opinion. It was my colleague's opinion, and that they are allowed to have that opinion because they have been, you know, they have a separate history of work. But because it was something so against how I thought about the community, it was very hard for me to then come back the next day and continue to work on that project, you know, because there was a mental block. Because I was like, okay, if you're not going to talk about these principles and these values, and if you're not going to inculcate them, translate them into this program, essentially, why should I even do this anymore, you know? And I remember having like this block for almost 2-3 days with a specific project, because it was about women's development, and I had certain ideas about it which were a little more a little more on the, how would I mean, they were a little more strong than the organization wanted it to come off. Because of course your organization has also survived for so long because their ideas work. So essentially it is two ideas just kind of trying to find a space. So I had that mental block for 2 whole days until I just got myself, and I realized, and like I said in my earlier section about limitations, that go rogue. What you do when you implement that project has nothing to do with how you write a program. It is it's a guiding layout. It's not essentially what you have to do word to word in the field. So I found my piece there. I was like, okay, let's just finish designing this. I'm the one who's facilitating it. I'm going to carry those ideas into the place of work, with of course educating myself on what the community is, how it's going to be, how it will be received. And of course I had to be very cautious of those factors also. Like, it's not just about my ideas getting justice, it's about my ideas doing justice to the community, for the community, with their consent. So of course, whatever you do, whether you go rogue, whether you decide that no, I'm going to do this no matter what, always make sure to understand your ideas from the perspective of the community. Always try to understand how it translates for the community. It's not you versus the organization, it is you for the community, right? So those are two very distinct things that you have to kind of understand when it comes to emotionally understanding your work. So I would say that, in such situations, TISS has a very high rate of attrition. A lot of organizations, even DSW has a very high rate of students who drop out within not drop out, sorry. They quit their jobs, their professions within a year of both placement or individually getting their jobs. And that is purely because organizations, whatever the political climate may be, organizations themselves are an ecosystem. And some of us will fit into that ecosystem, some of us will disturb that ecosystem, and some of us will just not be allowed into that ecosystem. And it is not a call on how we personally are as social workers. It is not a comment on our skills. It is not a comment on how we plan to work for the community, right? So it is very important to understand that there are lots of factors that come into play, including ideas which, it doesn't even have to be that technical. Sometimes you can just have a superior who does not want to, work with you. It can be in any field, it can be in any organization, it can be in a government funded organization. That happens as well. So sometimes the problem is not just you versus the organization, it can be you and versus the factors within the organization. So essentially, when it comes to dealing with this emotionally, it is extremely frustrating. And I actually ended up joining therapy at the beginning of this year, because I just needed a place to kind of talk about all the frustrations that I was feeling, and I had the privilege to be able to do that for myself. And I understand that a lot of social workers don't, because when I say that, you have to, when I say that dropout rates happen because, there's a lot of dissatisfaction between social workers and maybe what the organization expects, a lot of us also have to stay back in those organizations because the money is essential. To have a stable living is also essential, and I understand that. And in such situations, both as a community of social workers, as you individually as a social worker, and organizations must create spaces where you can talk, where you can express your ideas, where you can express your frustrations and not have to filter how you feel. Because I understand in today's day and age, it is very difficult for social workers to not be political or to not be a certain way, because we're seeing so much and it translates to the community and we understand that. So it is very essential that, when you walk into a boardroom, you're not carrying the organization's expectations on your shoulder. You're carrying the community into that boardroom and you're representing them. And no matter what it takes, be it emotionally, like if it's emotionally disturbing, if it's exhausting, as a social worker, you carry the community with you. So again, that is what my framework is, and that's why all my kind of conversation is also around that one particular fact. So therapy, talking to peers, writing about your experiences, going to group therapies, or even just having a network of social workers around you is essential, because you never know what you might learn from somebody else's experience. And that's why I still have, because of my previous place of work, I have a mix of support systems around me, which are both, they're very political, but then there are those who are a little apolitical and more about social justice. I mean, it works. So I had a lot of different, opinions to go to, understand from, and, to just find my spot in that, find my consolation in that. So I think, then some of these things I'd also like to go into. I want to talk about these when I talk about motivating factors. So first we're going to, I think we were supposed to talk about, I have it written down, I'm so sorry. Okay, so it's about skills. Now this,
Ma'am,
yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but so like you can even uh, talk about the cases or the particular
Yeah, I will bring that up now. Yeah.
experiences. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. So the next kind of subheading that we wanted to work on was the skills required to balance both um, your understanding of your work, doing justice to the community, was, and also able to survive in an organization. And I was talking to my colleagues before this, and I said that, I don't really have a lot of technical aspects that I want to talk about. I'm not a very technical person. I try to think of myself as somebody who's very fluid with how I understand my work. So this particular part, I want to start with an example, because I think when I was thinking about skills required, this was probably two examples, and I'll try to go quickly because I know we have less time. Is that, as part of Dipalia, I was asked to go to an affiliated school um, to kind of understand. There was a massive dropout happening with students. A lot of students from the classes of 4th to 10th essentially were dropping out. And the scale was so big that by the end of the year, the classrooms would shrink to less than 50% of what they used to be. So like they would almost be halved. And within that, girls would be the ones who would be dropping out more. So the school works in an area where there is a lot of diverse communities that are working together. So, and most of the students who are dropping out belong to a certain religion. So when I was, because I was because I am the person who looks into monitoring projects and evaluating projects, I was asked to go do a covert kind of operation, go visit these families and try to understand what the problems were, what the issues were. Now, as part of my organization, this work was extremely important because we had to understand what is affecting children here, what is affecting students here. So I did go. I went along with another colleague and we visited a lot of the homes of students who had dropped out. And we heard some very disturbing testimonies of what was happening in that school. And you know, to kind of like, I don't want to go too much into the example because it's the concept, like what happens after. So right after I got all that all the testimonies, and I was able to figure out the larger factors that were affecting these dropout rates, I went back to the school and I suggested that let's do a workshop. I will come and do a workshop with all of your teachers, and we'll figure out from there where, you know, this fault line lies. And this was something that I also was undertaking with the knowledge of the organization. Like, they knew that I was going to do this, and I was also advised to do this. So I went into this school just as a role of as my role as a social worker from this particular organization. I entered the school and I had a conversation with the teachers. You know, I had almost 2.5 hour sessions with 40 teachers at a time, and what I uncovered was very disturbing. The trends were very disturbing because um, it was religious discrimination that was happening in that school. And I kind of, you know, again, when I was with the community, I realized that I was a lot more empathetic. I was a lot more free flowing in the way I was talking. I was very involved with when I was dealing with the community. But when I came to the school, it was harder for me to understand these teachers, which was again, uh, it is something that you shouldn't. I mean, when I say that you have to be able to empathize with everybody, even if in your idea there is a these they are wrong or they are right or whatever bifurcations you want to use, you still have to be able to understand both sides. So, you know, I took these sessions with the teachers and I got all the reports, and you know, it was something that needed to be looked into ASAP. So I wrote a pretty expansive report and I submitted to the supervisor. But after that report went through, no action was taken. And not because nobody decided to take any action, but also because there were external factors. You know, the boards started coming, the boards were going to happen. The year end was coming around. I had other projects that were taking place. And then, of course, COVID happened. And so, you know, everybody got pushed to do their work from home. So a lot of external factors played into it. But the fact was that this topic about this dropout rate and what was happening in that particular school was never talked about again. So for someone like me, that was devastating because I put in so much personal time to, you know, visit these, and it was very far away. It's almost takes about 3 hours from Delhi to get to that school. So essentially, as a social worker, I feel like I had failed to represent the community because nobody was really addressing the problems that were happening with the community. And in that particular situation, it was a lesson that I had to learn. And it goes both to the emotional factors, but also to the skills that you need to have. Because every time after that, when I was in any way dealing with that particular school on paper or in general anything, you know, I always tried to incorporate solutions, situations, activities that would address that problem quite indirectly, because again, nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. So the idea was to, you know, try and manipulate solutions into anything and everything that we do. So the only one time that I was able to visit that school after my monitoring project was I had to give I had to give a session on menstrual hygiene and awareness. And so I was able to incorporate certain things which addressed the religious discrimination that was happening. I tried to do it as indirectly, as cleverly, as much as I could possibly, you know, because there were certain lines I couldn't push. You know, there were teachers who were present there, and so, you know, I wasn't really able to address those situations. But I made it a point to at least refer to things that indirectly would translate to action for the students. So when I talk about skills, I am mostly talking about how you negotiate, how you communicate, how you converse with students, how you kind of you know, like there's this saying that, you know, I don't know where I read it from, and I don't think it's a universal saying, but it was about big words fool big ideas, right? Or it can be also big words fool big people, because essentially you can use umbrella terms and hide your social work under that, your ideas under that, and then go ahead and implement them. So there was a situation where I did exactly that, which was the menstrual hygiene sessions. And I said that, you know, on paper, I just said that, you know, we will talk about bodies that menstruate. The fact that I said that and didn't say women's menstruation or, you know, menstrual cycles of women, essentially allowed me that loophole to talk about other bodies, which are not just man or woman. I hid that kind of a like that tactic or that skill or that particular intervention through my words. But at the same time, because I was going to Greater Noida, these schools in Greater Noida, I knew for a fact that if I talked about um, gender diversity, if I talked about other bodies that menstruate, if I tell them anything which is not socially accepted, our organization would not be able to come back to those schools. So I had to take a decision, which was both a risk. It was a risky decision to take, but when I first started my sessions, I made a rule that no teachers from those schools, no staff from those schools that we go to do these sessions in would sit through the sessions. It would just be me and whoever is helping me facilitate. So that helped. Nobody could really counter that because with the teachers there, I would say, nahi ma'am, आपके बच्चे हो सकता है आपके सामने ना बात कर पाए क्योंकि वो आपको हर रोज देखते हैं और ये बहुत पर्सनल चीजें हैं, तो हम उनसे अलग से ही बात करना चाहेंगे, right? No matter how close the teacher seemed to the students, there were a lot of teachers who didn't like that. They said, no, we want to know what you're teaching our students. But I made sure that, the doors were locked the minute the session started, and it was only me and the students there. So there are a lot of these skills are mostly about negotiation and are mostly about manipulation. And when I say manipulation, it has a very negative connotation, but I've realized through my work that it can have a lot of, it means to an end. If the end is development of the community, if the end is liberation of a community, if the end is self-actualization of the community on its own terms, then the means have nothing to do with the end, as long as, of course, you're not really doing anything that harms the cause, right? So, and also to learn how to paraphrase. I think that is one skill that, is very looked down upon. I remember I learned this word faffing when I was giving my boards. I think when I was giving my boards, a lot of students will say, yeah, I faffed that answer, or, like I was just faffing around with this answer. And I always thought that that's such a negative word. Like, you should always be able to write, concrete things. Every word should have a meaning. Every sentence should have a meaning. And I was so into that idea that I used to put so much stress on producing perfect pieces of literature. And I learned that actually that is more, sometimes in some cases, that is more detrimental to your cause than to just write big words that will fool big people, and you can go ahead and do the work that along with the community is required to be done. So my programs, the way I used to write the programs, the way I would implement them. So for example, I remember we got a private donation to do a workshop with students, or kind of set up a project with students where they would come and learn vocational skills. And this was being designed for Mustafabad, like for the children in the relief camps. And I thought that, the vocational skills that they wanted us to involve was stitching and sewing. And specifically for boys, it would just be to learn how to use computers and all of these things. And I remember very specifically writing down in my program implementation, in one of the smaller points I wrote was, encourage students who are involved in performing arts to get back to their training or whatever. Like, I wrote something like that. But basically what I did was, I tried to identify students who dance, who paint, who sing, and I tried to organize programs with those students performing for the rest of the children. Because in my head, I was going with the fact that art is therapy. So there were students who painted, who took classes. There were the kids who took classes of, painted with their fellow friends and all of these things. And that understanding, if you have it, you have to find a way to put it into your work. Even though this program was supposed to be only about vocational skills, this particular activity that I kept in it was not about vocational skills. It was just about letting children be children. So in any ideas that you have that you feel are not being welcomed, but for a fact are essential for the community, manipulate your way to making it happen. Negotiate. Because at the end of the day, everything else in a program will fall into place. Everything will happen. But you as social workers, your programs which you design should not be crutches for the community. It should be a tool that they use to self-actualize when your project period ends. Because nobody seems to prioritize the fact that a project does end. And when a project ends, if you have done what you think is justice to the community, then once you leave that field along with your project and all your datas and all your things, and you are ready to go and give satisfaction to the client, you are leaving a community behind. So if there are ideas that you can involve which have long-term consequences, go ahead and involve them. It doesn't matter. It is not about obeying your supervisors. It is not about obeying your clients or your donors. It is about doing justice to the community. And when I say doing justice to the community, like I said, organizations have their own opinions, other people have their own opinions. Your opinions should come from a place of research, a place of understanding the community, going and talking to the community, being able to identify factors, being able to empathize with the community. And these skills, I feel, nobody really talks about, because essentially they're clubbed under be empathetic. They're just clubbed as, empathy and something you feel. But negotiation, manipulation, how you use the language, how you faff certain things that need to be done but others may not accept, it is up to you, because nobody knows the community better than you, especially if you've worked in a community for longer than a year or a couple of even 6 months, and the organization does not send anybody there other than you. You are the only person involved with the community. I would say that you have every right to have a say in how that program is designed. So it is not just about fulfilling the organization or the CSR values or ethics and whatever they want to check off their list. It has to be about the community. So I suggest go rogue. Just do what you have to do, and then you can faff your way out of it. It's not that difficult. So and the other thing I learned, other skill that I think everybody knows about this, but I still feel like I should mention this, is patience. And it's very hard to have patience in organizations that are not particularly accepting. Thankfully, in both of my organizations, it was not that big of a problem. But I know, and I've heard of my colleagues who have worked in organizations that really don't accept their ideas and the kind of things they want to do. So I would say that just, I mean, these are skills that you have to know. And that's why I feel like as social workers, one thing that I've considered doing is do a management program or do an MBA program or a diploma course and just learn how to deal with clients, learn how to deal with donors, learn how to deal with your supervisors. Because essentially the kind of work, again, there are a lot of social workers who choose to do justice to the organization. They might be only organizationally inclined. That is perfectly fine. But all of those decisions stem from the fact of what is your political framework. Where do you stand in your social work, with the community or with the organizations? Once you make those decisions for yourself, everything else will fall into place, and you will yourself be inclined to finding solutions, creative solutions to your problems. And when I say, coming to the motivational factors, honestly, it's not that I didn't face a lot of negative things in both of those organizations. I think most of us face it, be it, colleague to colleague, discrimination, whether it be, for example, like in one of the organizations, there were cases of body shaming, there were fat shaming, there were cases of bullying for other colleagues, and it happened across both organizations. It's not that that doesn't happen. But essentially, when I would come back home and feel bad about those things and all of, especially when it happened with me in the second organization, I think when I came home, the only thing that made me get up the next day and go back to work was because there were students who were waiting for me, who were waiting to hear from me, who wanted me to come visit them, who essentially got involved with the projects and activities that I planned for them, and they wanted me to involve myself with them as well. So it wasn't work, and I can say this with, of course, the idea that I understand that if I had to leave, I could have left, because I have the privilege to be able to do that, and I understand that a lot of people don't. So find something that helps motivate you. Now, I'm somebody who hates traveling, in the sense that I hate being in a car for too long. So when we were going to Greater Noida, these trips would take about 2.5 hours, 3 hours each side. So, I had to reach office at 6:30 in the morning, and then I would come back home by like 8 in the evening. And honestly, sitting for those 2.5 hours or 3 hours in that cab and not really having a 9 to 5 schedule, having it much, much longer, I think the only thing that really helped me get into my groove and get ready for those workshops was that the minute I would reach school, a horde of girls, these really, just beautiful students, beautiful girls with so much energy would come running out to hug me, or they would, just want me to be around them. And when you work with kids, like, the biggest motivating factor is the fact that they want love. So when you walk into a classroom, they see you as that. They see you as somebody who's there to teach them, to play with them, to engage with them, right? So for me, that was my motivation. And in my previous work also, the community was my motivation. It was about the fact that, when, for example, when I was part of the Kisan Long March, I wasn't that involved because I think around that time some other things were also happening. But at the same time, I've been to a lot of other farmer-led movements in Delhi, some of the major protests, and sometimes you would just sit with the people and the way that they, as social workers, like, communities want to engage with you. They will welcome you with open arms. As a social worker, you go there and you sit in their house and you are empathetic even a little bit. They consider you to be their own person. So for me, that was a motivating factor. Ultimately for me, the community was my motivating factor. And despite facing some very essential issues in both of these organizations, I tried to stick it out for as long as I could. Of course, currently I'm not associated with Depalia because the COVID situation happened and a lot of organizations had to downscale. But I think the other things that you have to think about is, I understand the whole money versus the job satisfaction part. And so in that case, again, I would say, the skills of negotiation, manipulation, using resources like therapy and group therapy and writing, all of these things are essential to balance that out if possible. But if an organization truly is controversial to your principles, to your ethics, then I would encourage you to find a different place. I would encourage you to start something else. But there is one thing that, with our generation, that, and I'm saying it as, I think it might be a little hypocritical of me to say it, but we, on one hand, we have all this, skills, all this information about, mental health awareness and, being able to do justice to ourselves. We are social workers, so it's a little more progressive as a field of study and as a field of work. So we talk about quitting, we talk about leaving a lot more often than maybe some other branches of work. But at the same time, social work is not about instant solutions. So it is also up to us to maybe find and work out ways to survive in organizations, because as a social worker, anybody can fill your seat. आपके बाद 5 और लोग आएंगे, 10 और लोग आएंगे, 15 और लोग आएंगे, but each change in person, each little rift affects the community. So essentially, if you find a place of work that ultimately you're able to work in, think long term, because social change is a long term process. It is not, we are not activists, we are not particularly involved in the government, we are not the ones writing policies. Yes, we are critiquing them, we are analyzing them, all of that, but we are social workers. We are a cog in that machine, we are a wheel in that machine. So it must be a long term plan to exist in organizations. So to try and find that, again, I think is essential. I think other than that, I would say that, be patient, and definitely, and this is something that not a lot of people, again, I have never heard somebody say it to me, but it's about trying to find a happy place within that organization. So thankfully, I had, I had a lot of colleagues who were as young as me, who were incredibly aligned with, we all were incredibly aligned with the same idea of working. And that really helps. So, being in an organization, you don't exist as a sole identity or entity. So try and find other people who think like you, band with them, and, maybe you'll build a community of social workers that will essentially then provide you that care, provide you that support, provide you that shoulder, right? And I think, and I would like to say that social work is not a glamorous job. It really isn't. It involves long hours. It involves a lot of emotional effort. Like, for example, as a social worker, people can call you up, especially if your phone number is there with the community. People can call you up at any time of the day. When I was working in my previous place of work, I would be sleeping at home on a Saturday, like at 10:30, and I would get a call from somebody saying, "Oh, this happened, and we need your intervention immediately." All of these things, so anything can happen, and it is not a glamorous job unless it's a CSR corporate office kind of space, because there is still the situation is a lot more controlled than in organizations that are ultimately completely working on the field. So it is not a glamorous job, and I think going into social work, you have to prepare yourself for certain skills, certain ways of coping that are essentially going to help you survive in this field. And for example, for me, that would have been therapy. I waited a long time to go into therapy, but ultimately when I did, I found myself functioning better at my place of work. But at the same time, it helped me also to empathize with my colleagues, some of whom I could not relate to because they weren't exactly on my team. But it helped me to build cohesion. It helped me to bring myself together and work with them and not be an isolated figure. Whatever your political framework may be, whether you are essentially a black sheep in your organization or whatever it can be anything. So I think the motivating factor has to be these two things. Find a community of like-minded people, be involved, engage yourself with them, maybe mentor other people or find a mentor for yourself, or just find people who think like you, go to therapy, go to group therapy, find these spaces. And also I feel like this, as Tissians, we need to build that space. We don't have a space where social, we don't, I mean, essentially, yes, we have class groups and email threads, all of that is there, but systemically we don't really have an understanding of mental health in social work, and nobody really prepares you for that. They prepare you for all the political aspects, the financial aspects, and you'll be taught how to talk to a client, you'll be taught how to do certain activities with them, but no one really stops you and tells you, okay, you're a social worker, it's not a glamorous job, you need some help, so get some help, right? So this is something that we as a community need to build as well. And I think with that, I'd like to end. I hope I've not missed out any points, but I think these are things that I have learned from my experiences, and there is so much more for me to say, but there's a time limit, so I don't want to cross that. But yeah, I think these are factors that really helped me survive or deal with the hiccups that I faced in my organization, and also helped me realize about what my motivating factor is, and why, despite having some very debilitating factors in my professional career, I still want to go back to it. I still want to stay where I am and continue to work there. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. And it was a very comprehensive and I can say a very motivating as well as professional approach towards social work practice. And at the same time, I think what I personally reflect on your discussion about when you started about the project designing, the diversity in organizations, the negotiating with the organization stakeholders, the supervisor or the clients. At the same time, keeping community and their needs at the center. More than all this, from all these aspects of discussion, we can reflect about how there needs to be a platform for discussion about the same things which we are discussing today. Uh, it's not just, as you said, there have been various multiple experiences. Even we talked on our last call, and due to the time limitations, you have not been able to share. But the main part, when you talk about group therapy or when you talk about building that ecosystem or that network where you can discuss and talk so that you can learn and thus grow as a profession, as a professional social worker, not just about community justice, that is always the priority, but moving beyond that as well, looking yourself as a professional social worker, how we can do. I think the aspect of discussion is the major part, and so that's why I'm so glad and again honored to have you on this platform.
I'm so glad to have a platform to be able to come and talk about this. Thank you.
Yeah, and then we are equally honored to be your listeners. As my personal experiences have been in TISS also, in that sense that people want to discuss. I see in the curiosity or in students to discuss, but the academic circle, as well
Yeah.
as the need to find relevant people to discuss, or the lack
There's
of
no
those kind of,
outlet. Yeah.
yeah. So I think this serves a very greater purpose than just about being a career guidance aspect of social work or development practice. And we are already getting appreciation that the webinar was very enriching and informative, especially
Yeah.
regarding the skills as a social worker. I was
Yeah. Thank
engaged
you.
people
Yeah.
were engaged in the entire session. So, ma'am, it's an honor for us. I would like participants. We can move on to some Q&A for 10 minutes, ma'am.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, if any participants have any question to ma'am regarding any aspect of program designing, implementation, or negotiation of value systems, they can unmute themselves and ask. Or even you can type on chat box. If I think Tanya is raising her hand. Tanya, if you want to ask, you can unmute or you can type on the chat box too.
Yeah, so can I go ahead?
Yeah, sure.
Not not exactly relevant to program designing, and so I just wanted to share something like I was engaged with a program at Tughlakabad in Delhi, and even though I went there with under the guidance of familiar stockholders, supervisors, and 19 counterparts, we encountered an easy experience. Like my own safety was at stake. So while at one hand I diligently look up to for the career in development sector, but somewhere or the other, like my concern lies in my own safety. So there's this always inner dilemma and insecurity. So how can I go about it? Like you talked about emotional intelligence. So if you can throw some light on this, thank you.
I think I actually completely relate to the question that you've asked because right at the beginning, my kind of issue stemmed from the fact that I would constantly be very self-deprecating about the fact that especially when I worked in my first place of work was because I was working with communities from marginalized sections. So for a long time, I would be very afraid to speak out or speak up or express my opinions because I felt that as somebody who belongs to a very privileged community, I didn't really have a leg to stand on, right? And at the same time, when I was working in the North Delhi riots, when I went to the camps, when I visited, I was visually very much standing out along with a lot of other people who were also working there. So I completely understand with the idea that sometimes it can feel a little othering, it can feel a little scary to be involved with communities that you may not be used to, who might not be used to you. And honestly, the only way to overcome that is to, I don't know, like I think for me it was about talking. It was about the way I talk. I honestly am a very awkward person and I can't hold a conversation with strangers for no reason. But what had helped me was that I used to watch one of my friends and a colleague who was like, जिसको बात करना बहुत पसंद है. She can have conversations with anybody. And watching her and observing her and how she talked to people, I brought that into the way I was talking to the community. So I'm someone who tries to talk very formally. I'm always very formal, and I get criticized for that a lot too. But to learn from that skill, to be a conversationalist, because once you open that channel of conversation, you get included, and your safety in itself, those concerns that you have, and some of them can run very deep, and I understand that and I acknowledge that. But the minute you open that channel of communication and you try to understand your presence and what the consequences of your presence are in that particular situation, it'll be easier for you to it'll be easier for you to kind of deal with that. And like I said, a lot of these things are not technical skills, they're literally your behaviors, how you behave, how you move, how you talk. When I was working with handloom weavers, I made it a point to wear handloom saris to meetings, and it had nothing to do with how I dress or anything. It was purely the fact that by wearing that, I felt a little more connected. I had something to talk about. I had an opening line. I had a way to build trust. Because at the end of the day, social workers, no matter which community you are from, you are an outsider until the community accepts you. So you have to find behaviors that allow you to do it. And as far as concerns that you have for your own self, talking to your own other people or your own colleagues who have gone through the same process will definitely help. How they worked it out, what methods they used. I think that would essentially help. I hope I've answered your question, because I know it's not a very technical answer. But
Yes, yes.
yeah.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, so a kind of a gender aspect also comes
Mm-hmm.
in this practice, as well as you know, I won't say kind of a color, race aspect, color aspect,
Yes, yes,
you know.
yeah.
So how to deal with this is, again, I guess, very contextual as well as very behavioral, I guess.
Yeah, I think, in most, so when I went to North Delhi as well, I had a Muslim colleague with me. I had one of my female Muslim colleagues with me, because it was already an understanding that somebody from the community should also be with you, somebody who can relate to the community. So I think that is also essential. And when it comes to being a female and going into a community where they're mostly men and you may not feel comfortable, you have every right to ask for somebody to accompany you. You have every right. I mean, you don't have to accept every situation the way it is. You can just say, I would like to have a male colleague come with me because I feel safer. And that is completely your right to say. It does not reflect how you think about the community. It does not reflect anything else other than the fact that you are asking for something that helps you work better. So go ahead and do that. Ask for that particular person to come with you. Ask for that male colleague to come with you, and just yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I guess, Tanya, you get some more insights on the answers.
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, there is some question again on the chat box that says, can you suggest some reading or books that give us more insights on behavioral needs of social work profession?
I will have to get back to you on that. I mean, if you leave me your email ID, I can send you a list of books. But the thing is that I haven't really read a lot of literature which is specifically deals with social work. I had to read a lot of books about how to do group therapy, how to speak to a client, and these are some things you will find in social work theory. But a lot of this you will find in books that, for example, there's this line of work called psychiatric social work. Then there is counseling social worker. There is a psychological social work field. So anything associated with these terms will talk about behavioral needs of a social worker, not specifically just social work theory. So I would say branch out your literature, go into psychology, read texts from other universities. So India doesn't really have a very specific line of resources for counseling social workers or psychiatric social work. A lot of this exists in Canada and USA, and some European countries have a lot of work in this field. So I would suggest looking into, Googling these things and finding sources from other countries as well. But I definitely have 2-3 books that I can't currently recall. But if you leave me something, I can just send it to you, or I can communicate that to you somewhere.
Yeah. Even a book by, I guess, Grace Matthews, which says From Sympathy to Empathy. Maybe
Right. Yes. Yes.
that
Yeah.
also, and there is a kind of a example therein that says that अगर गरीब की मदद करनी हो तो तुम अगर गरीब के बाजू में मंदिर में बैठ के भीख मांगने नहीं लगोगे, and but you empower them. So in that context, I guess, also there is another book for personal development called Emotional Intelligence, at, and there is some word before then there is Emotional Intelligence 2.0. So maybe Shraddha, this Grace Matthews work is too great on case work, social work practice.
I think social workers do need to
Hi.
understand the concepts of sympathy and empathy. That's essentially a very important aspect. And that's why I said, like, if you want to empathize with anything, the first empathetic skill is to find what it is that you have in you that makes you similar to somebody else. So for me, that was the feeling of unbelongingness, because I was an adopted child, not a real child. So how do I accept that? How do I find my space? So find something in you that can relate to all of these other issues as well, and you will find a way to work through that.
Yeah, I guess, Shraddha, you get some answers here. So any other questions, or can we conclude? I guess
Yeah, I can leave my email ID if anybody wants to get in touch.
Yes, sure. So I have your email ID. If anyone wants to, yeah, you can even type in, ma'am. And more than that, if anyone wants the email ID, you can message me, as my number is on the posters, and I can forward. So I think we can conclude. And again, we are, as MyTISS and Sunday Samvad team and TISS students, we are very glad that you gave us your precious time on a Sunday evening,
Thank you so
and
much for inviting me.
gave us a very grassroots as a very professional perspective about our own lives, because that is what, if we are uh, going into the field, we need to have a perspective about what our life is going to be. And
Yeah.
and this kind of perspective is very rare and one of a kind. So we are glad and honored again, ma'am, to have you with us and
Thank you
talk
for
with
having
us.
me.
And I think we'll stay in touch. And and one of the purpose of Sunday Samvad is that the alumni who come here can, if they can, into their through their circles, through their networks, facilitate internship, job opportunities. To You can anytime send us the vacancies or opportunities. We forward it to we forward it on our website and as well as on our channels, so that students can get into a career that they aspire for. So we'll be in touch, ma'am, and thank you again. Thank you, participants,
Yeah,
also for your patience.
absolutely.